And that was a security measure so that no one scientist or very few scientists had an overview. They all worked on parts. And you began to feel that your little part was insignificant. Also, you didn't know the whole picture. And you had, because you had security clearance and because it was never clear what things were restricted and what things weren't, you tended not to talk to anybody except the people in your department because you were afraid of talking about something that was classified and you were never quite sure what was and what wasn't. They followed up this compartmentalization within the lab to compartmentalization by geographical location. So there is no one place in the United States that produces the whole weapon cycle. Each place does their little part. And you're standing across the street from one of the think tanks. This has undermined the quality of science in the United States of America, because the science has not been on the open, peer-reviewed scientific journals, but there's a whole internally circulated, classified documents where they talk to one another in a closed circle and they don't get the criticism, nor do the physicists understand what the doctors and the people in biology are seeing. So each group is trusting the other group. And that brings me to my last point. Maybe many of you are unaware of the large number of radiation casualties since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not counting those two tragedies. But with the most conservative kinds of assumptions, the number of casualties from our radiation industries since 1945 is between 10 and 20 million. And when I talk about casualties, I'm talking about the cancers, which may or may not be fatal, the infant mortality and the congenital malformations and the genetic diseases introduced into the population. That's a global number. If you wanted to assign it for weapon testing, there have been more than 1,600 nuclear bombs set off on our planet, about half of them by the United States and the other half by the Soviet Union, Britain, France, India, China, and South Africa, with maybe a few more waiting in the wings to start. We also have a legacy of dead and dying uranium miners and millers, the transportation people, the people who work in the nuclear facilities, and so on. We've not acknowledged these deaths. And these deaths are a preparation for mega death, very similar to the buildup before World War II. World War II did not start with the gas chambers. It started with preparing the people by restricting the Jewish people to go to the supermarkets only between 4 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And then when that was accepted, it was escalated. They were eventually moved into ghetto areas for their own protection. Then the ghetto areas, as they became more crowded, became hotbeds of infectious diseases. Then it became a public health measure to put up walls around the ghettos, and so on. The whole thing escalated. It's a brutalization period, and we are in it. And so today is a day not only to remember the hundreds of thousands killed in the first atomic blast, but also a time to remember the uranium miners that have died and the millers, a time to remember the people in the Marshall Islands who are right now suffering the long-term health effects, the people in French Polynesia who are right now experiencing nuclear bomb blasts, the Inuit people and the northern people, the Lapps that have gotten most of the fallout from the Soviet tests, the Chinese people that are suffering from the Chinese tests. Let's remember all these victims, and let's realize we're talking between 10 and 20 million people already, even if we don't have further accidents or a nuclear war. We're talking about slow poison and death of the species by simultaneously degrading the gene pool and the environment that's supposed to support. We're talking about producing children physically less able to cope and giving them more to cope with. And this, in anybody's language, is a death process. So I would suggest we have about a minute of silence and remember all these people, because that's what today is all about, so we don't repeat the killing, so we don't do it on a mega death level. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bertel. We have another distinguished visitor here with us today. Mel King is here, running for Congress in the 8th Congressional District. He's been a longtime activist and friend of people who are struggling for justice and for peace. And I'd now like to introduce Mel King.
Thank you. This commemoration of Hiroshima Day ought to be a very, very sober one. I think it is important that we understand that as we talk about the issue of potential nuclear warfare and destruction, that it is not a question of no first use. We're talking about no third use, because we have already used the weapon twice to affect the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. What I think is important as we are in this environment, and as I look at the scientists and the engineers, is I wonder why it is that that talent, that energy, that creativity that they have is wasting its time chasing missiles throughout the stars when they could be working on ways in which they could figure out how to get the tea to run on time all the time. When they could be figuring out how to help people who are physically challenged to be able to get total access to all of what is available to people in this society. How they could be figuring out how to deal with the problems of malnutrition and hunger, and to make sure that people all over this planet are well fed, that they're clothed, and that there are no homeless people anywhere. That's what our genius should be working on. Now, I read in the papers that there is this concern about protectionism, making sure that the workers in this country are protected from workers overseas. But I understand very clearly that the people in Japan and the people in Germany, because of the war, had their swords and their guns beaten into think shares. And they thought about the products that would be socially useful, and we buy those products. What has happened is that our genius has had their creativity beaten into missiles and weapons of destruction, which makes it impossible for us to have the products that compete with the Japanese and the Germans. We could use your genius to create a more humane and living environment for all people on this planet. And to do that, we all need to understand that we must change from the politics of confrontation to the politics of negotiation. That these are political problems that exist and that we need political solutions for these problems. I'm here today in support of these groups that are pursuing peace. Through them, we're going to be able to have peace of mind within ourselves, peace on the streets between people, and peace on earth between nations. But it is going to take a people who are committed, who are willing to go to jail in their nonviolent way in order to make sure that that is going to happen. So I join with you. I signed the Stockholm Resolution that was put in there by W.E.B. Du Bois some 40 years ago. And all I can say to you is continue to struggle, because we are going to win. We're going to get the genius that is here working on things that are socially useful, and we're going to be the approach that is going to lead to peace. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Peace Camp. I hope you stay around. The folk singer Charlie King will be here at 2 o'clock, and there's many more events. Thank you very much.
For his wife, the comb, the tortoiseshell comb, and the fan, that precious little walnut sewing kit. These are things that give him another dimension. And one of the descriptions of him after his death is that of a man who had the gentleness of a woman, and that gave him a special respect in his social life.
What do you think? His uncle was called Marshall. I mean, this is a terrible irony, it seems. At the moment he'd won this victory, we learned that his uncle had been called Marshall. Or was not have been called, he didn't learn that then, but I mean, he learned that his uncle was in bad trouble. What do you think his reaction must have been to that?
I think he must have been shattered by it. A man who cared as much as he did about honor, who made statements later on in life that have been recorded during a period when he was involved in training men around 1840, training officers, that he would die before he would strike colors on this vessel. I believe that, and I'm sure everyone believed that. For him to have had a close relative, one that he respected, who lived with him, it was William Hull, who secured for him his commission in the Navy. It must have been a shattering blow, and we don't find anything about it in the correspondence. But you know, given the kind of man he was, it must have hurt him deeply.
He also seems to, well, maybe you can talk about how he responded to a claim. Because he seems to be modest in a certain way.
Well, yes, he...
maybe that's not correct.
He was modest. And yet I'm pausing because there are things that form contradictions to that. He was a good Yankee, and he knew that he had prize money coming to him, and when it wasn't forthcoming, he let the Navy know that he was in fact due to get, that he did earn that money. And the correspondence shows that he placed a value on Guerriere of $200,000 and suggested that that be the prize money. What Congress came up with was yet another compromise. They voted the gold medal for him and silver medals for his officers, bronze ones for his men, and $100,000 to be divided up amongst the crew. But he did not modestly say after the battle, "You can keep the money." He pressed for it. And he was known, there was another interesting situation later on when his crew was not paid. He was living at the time, he went to the North End where he was living at the time. The men were not paid, so they formed together in a kind of what seems to have been a good-natured band, and including musical instruments, and went to his house to get his attention. And what that says to me is that they knew that all they had to do was get the old man's attention and they'd get their money. So they weren't mad at Hull. They didn't see that they were angry at Hull. They knew that he was not the problem. And of course he did listen to a delegation from the group, and of course the next day they did get paid.
Yeah. What about Mrs. Hull? Do you have any impression of her?
My impression of her is that we're given the impression that she's a very attractive person. We have to be given the impression that she was ever so slightly aggressive. She picked out Isaac Hull as the man she wanted to marry, and she accomplished her goal. But she accomplished it so well that she made Isaac Hull feel that he had captured her. We see her as a very loyal, loving person. She went to sea with him, as was the custom at the time. And they seem to have been a good match. They seem to have aged together. They seem to have grown together in the years following their marriage and early on in 1830.
What was his response to not, or maybe you can explain why he didn't continue to run the Constitution, why after this great victory he was taken off the ship?
Well, he wasn't taken off as much as he asked to be reassigned. He had lost his older brother in 1810, and that gave him extra family responsibilities, and he took those responsibilities very seriously. And shortly before the battle with Guerriere, he lost his second brother, and that was a tremendous blow to him, and a big added responsibility. It caused him to write the letter asking for reassignment. It caused him to turn down public appearances, especially one in New York City. He was deeply hurt by this, and it affected his life. It affected the rest of his life because his priorities were such that that his family came first, and he knew that he was the one who had to take care of these kids, and he did it.
What do you think his faults were?
Well, I think his faults from a professional standpoint probably could be that he didn't play the political game. He knew his craft. He knew the craft of sailing, of seamanship, better than anyone else in his time. But I have a feeling that had he been more tactful, say in his dealing with this Commodore title, that other greater honors might have been bestowed on him by the Navy. I think they saw him as a bit of a renegade. He was, of course, given the great opportunity through this victory to have turned it, let's say, as John Glenn has done, into higher offices and greater acclaim. But he very stubbornly chose to think of himself as a frigate captain who wanted no higher honor. And I think if there is a fault, we could say that a professional fault, it was that he didn't capitalize on that to the
to take